Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond Death, the podcast that isn't afraid to talk about death and people who work with the deceased and their relatives. We are your hosts. I am Mark. I'm a radiographer and a lecturer in forensic radiography. And with me is,
I'm Lindsay and I'm a very experienced forensic radiographer. Nice to see you today.
and Lindsay. Who do we have with us today?
Well, we are very excited indeed. We've got Jason Payne-James. Hello, Jason. How are you doing?
Hi, Lindsay and Mark. I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm sweltering in the heat, but
It
so is
is
everybody.
challenging. Well, I'm just going to read a little bit out from your bio before we go into the questions to let people know a little bit about you. They probably do know about you already, but Jason Payne-James is a specialist in forensic and legal medicine and a consultant forensic physicians. His interests are broad-ranging, including documentation and interpretation of injury, evidential sampling, wound and scar interpretation, complaints against healthcare professionals, sexual assault, non-accidental injury, intimate partner violence, non-fatal strangulation, restraint and less lethal systems, miscarriages of justice, healthcare in detention, cause of death, death investigation, medical negligence, death and harm in custody, substance use and abuse, I suppose, human rights abuses and torture, and cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. He is an honorary clinical professor at the William Harvey Research Institute, Queen Mary University of London. He's chair of the UK Scientific Advisory Committee on the medical implications of less lethal weapons, and a member of the Specialist Advisory Committee on the Joint Royal Colleges of Physicians Training Board on Forensic and Legal Medicine. He's president of the European Council of Legal and Forensic Medicine, and he's a director of Forensic Health Care Services Limited. And I think I'm going to just stop there because it is an enormous bio and you've packed an awful lot in, and we're going to get more out of your life with these questions. Are you happy for me to start with question one, Jason?
Yes, of course I am.
Okay, question one, easy one. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how on earth did you get into being such a specialist in forensic and legal medicine, and all about your publications, and how did you get to be in the position that you're in now?
Well, I think as with lots of us, the way your career ends up really is dependent on sliding doors, luck, and opportunities that you take. I qualified in medicine a long time ago in 1980. And my initial thoughts were that I wanted to be a consultant surgeon in a hospital. And I started surgical training. I got my fellowships in surgery from both Edinburgh and London. And during that time, I realized I loved surgery, but I wasn't so keen on surgeons. Many of my friends, I should say, are surgeons, but I felt I wanted a more medical, and by that I mean a non-surgical approach. And so I started doing work in gastroenterology. During that time, I spent about 4 years doing research, particularly in areas of nutrition, that is intravenous feeding and nasogastric feeding,
Mm.
which was fascinating. But then after that, I had to make a decision about whether I wanted to stay in hospital medicine. At that time, as a kind of additional or side, I suppose we call it a side hustle nowadays, I became what's called a glorified police surgeon in London. That's called a forensic medical examiner. So at that time, I started round about the late 1980s, working as a forensic medical examiner, not employed by, but working with the Met Police. And at that time, I became interested in crime, in substance use, substance misuse, mental health issues, and the interpretation of injury and the effects of injury and the relationship of those with criminal matters. So that was very broadly what started me on my forensic and legal medicine path. The important thing to note is that I'm not a pathologist, and I don't do autopsies, I don't do post-mortem examinations. All my work, predominantly in the early days, related to living aspects of forensic medicine.
Yeah, Jason, that's a really interesting trajectory going from gastroenterology to forensic medicine. I just wondered what it was that you like most about your work, and what sort of other professions you connect with. You must work with all sorts of different people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Where I've been lucky, well, it might be my character defect, but every 5 years, and it has worked out if I look back on my career and look forward in my career as well, is that every 5 years or so, some other opportunity, some other area of interest has come up. So, for example, in recent years, the development of the medical examiner system in England and Wales, which is the system by which every death now has to be reviewed by a medical examiner team before registration of death can occur. And of course, this is how I became even more embedded in what I broadly call the death space. And it's at a time, so in 2019, I became a medical examiner, lead medical examiner at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. Some of your listeners will be aware that since September the 9th, 2024, as a result of changed legislation in death regulation, that every death has to be reviewed by a medical examiner if it's not reviewed by a coronial team, because if it's not, then registration of death can't occur. So going back from that, what I've always found, the things that interest me are where there are, as it were, relatively clear-cut problems that need to be solved. I'm always very wary about sort of when people suggest, "Oh, are you a medical detective?" Because I'm very, very aware, and yourselves in radiology, radiography, will know that all we're doing, each of us in our various roles, is contributing one part of the jigsaw in the overall aspect of whether it's a criminal matter or a family matter or civil matter. But I've always enjoyed how those different parts relate because of the fact that I, and probably about 10 of my contemporaries were at the stage where we started doing portfolio careers, where we weren't doing full-time general practice, we weren't doing full-time hospital medicine, but we were dipping in and out of different areas of expertise, which I recommend wholly to everybody. But what that has enabled me to do is to have a number of areas where I have interest, whether be it law, be it medicine, be it pathology, be it death, and the effects of death on the bereaved, and looking at causes of death. The common thing about all of these, from my perspective, is they embrace in some way medicine, and I think my contacts as a medical examiner with the bereaved and with those treating the deceased relatives of the bereaved mean that you have a very holistic approach to understanding what people go through. And just coming back to the medical examiner role, which started in 2019, and within a few months, the COVID pandemic came in. I think that's what changed the whole landscape of death generally and how people understood it. People were much more happy. That was people who are not in the medical field, were much more worried about whether or not their bereaved relative, whether the cause of death, whether the treatment they received was appropriate or not, and they became more willing to challenge it. And that's where the opportunity for being able to speak to families and try and reassure them in some cases, and where they raised issues of concern, as we've all seen in hospital scandals over the years. One of the initiators of the medical examiner system. All of that, it combines with me being a doctor, having an interest in law, and also believing that it's important that evidence of any kind, when it's put to a court, that court can rely on it in being accurate and safe. So that's a rather sort of wordy and prolonged description of what I enjoy about what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Every day is different.
Absolutely.
Every day is different, and every day is a challenge, and it continues to be so. I think I'm very lucky. I'm in many respects I'd be past retirement age, but I can't see any realistic chance of me wanting to retire because I'm lucky that everything I enjoy.
Everything sounds interesting, and it's always, as you say, constantly changing.
Yes.
And one of the other points I was going to pick up there, you mentioned the roles of radiography and radiology, and obviously in recent years, particularly in post-mortem death investigation, that the use of that, and particularly CT, has been coming to the fore. I just wondered how you'd seen that change over your career, and where you see that going in the future. Do you see an increasing reliance on things like radiology, or is it just part of the jigsaw?
Well, perhaps because I'm not a pathologist, I am quite partisan, and I am a huge supporter of post-mortem CT for many reasons, not just faith or personal reasons, or families not wanting perhaps um, their loved one to have undergone an invasive post-mortem, but because it's very clear that it provides, in many cases, not all, we know that, but in many cases it provides answers about cause of death in a non-invasive and rapid way. My own interest in it is particularly at the moment, and this is where I'm looking to the sort of perhaps the next few years, is that traditionally, of course, coroners are reliant on forensic pathologists, hospital-based pathologists doing post-mortems in the 30% or so of coronial notifications that are unknown causes of death. Previously, those causes of death have normally been determined by open autopsy. Post-mortem CT for many of those, perhaps 80% or so, means that is not necessary. Now, at the moment, it is generally required by coroners that a pathologist then looks at, with the report from the forensic radiology, looks at the pre-existing clinical details and comes up with the cause of death. I think it is certainly a time when others, for example, people who have been medical examiners who are determining and confirming causes of death every day now on a regular basis, that this is an area that can be expanded and can be improved upon by better review of notes and scrutiny of records, by the use of post-mortem CT techniques, and then interpreting and putting that all together. And what does that do? I think it means there are two things: that it reassures families that perhaps the cause of death is appropriate, and it also adds, on a much bigger scale, on a big data scale, in the long term, it will provide ultimately better big data for health services as and when finances ever improve, to be better directed to particular disease and relevant disease.
But there must be aspects of your work that you don't like. So what are the biggest challenges been that you've had to overcome over the years?
In terms of the clinical work and the work with patients, I don't think there's anything I've ever really disliked. I'm not a great fan of pure process and process for the sake of process. I think that too many decisions, whether we're looking at the police, whether we're looking at the NHS, whether we're looking at law, people are reluctant to give opinions or to make decisions because of a kind of fear that many of us have about, if I do something wrong, will I get into trouble?
Yeah.
So I find that many things that could have moved on more quickly, and I'd include actually post-mortem CT scanning as one, is that if we look at what could have been achieved even 5 or 10 years ago, I think we could be much further advanced. The example I always give is just prior to the COVID pandemic, so late December 2019, I would say the vast majority of us were not familiar with Zoom or Teams.
Yes, yeah.
And for example, the courts had been looking at trying to get remote evidence provided. They've been working at it for decades. And yet within 2 to 3 months, because there was a need, all of us, as we're showing today, all of us became familiar with methods and means of communication that just speeded everything up and simplified things.
Yeah, excellent. That's a very good analogy, isn't it, actually? Lindsay, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Yeah, gosh, technology. Look how it's changed us. The communication. I mean, I love it, but you're right. It accelerated because of COVID, and now we're all in touch, and the world changed dramatically. And I also take on your point about experts not wanting to go to court anymore because of the challenges that they might get, and they're too afraid of losing their careers. You have to have a lot of bottle, don't you, to be a medical expert, I think.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure well, you're right in a way. People are very, very concerned about giving opinions. I mean, there is, and I won't even mention it by name, but there is the one trial or the one case that is everyday headline news in broadcast media at the moment. I'm often asked to comment on it,
mm,
but the simple fact is I haven't seen all the evidence, and
mm,
it's inappropriate for me to. But this is something that I think will change the nature of expert evidence ultimately when whatever decisions are made. But these will be some years down the line.
mm,
And I think what has happened and a real trend away from clinicians who are, say, let's take pediatricians as an example. Most pediatricians, and I hope they won't mind me speaking on their behalf, don't really want to spend their time going to court. They want to treat their patients, and that's
mm,
what most people want to do. The rise of forensic and legal medicine through things like the introduction 20 years ago of the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine has meant that there is a cohort of people who are clinicians, but they are also trained in law and police procedure and
mm,
are happy to go to court without the concerns that everybody else has, because they understand how evidence should be given. But for most of us, we don't want to go to court. We don't want to be
mm,
cross-examined in court.
mhm. It's
And
not
that's
not familiar territory, is it at all, unless you've got a toolbox of training.
no.
Um, I'd like to ask you about how you cope with the emotional side of your work, because you're part of a big jigsaw. I mean, Mark and I, we did the 7/7 bombings, we've done tsunami, we've done all sorts of things. So we've seen, close-up horror, but we're again trained to do it, so we can do it. That's why we're able to do our jobs. But we do get the emotional side, and that's one of my specialist areas. I'm always interested in how uh, our guests do cope with emotional side. How do you switch off?
I think you separate your work as much as you can from, but and Lindsay, I'm very aware of what you've been doing, and you too, Mark. And it's sometimes because there aren't that many of you or us doing the same thing, you're always overwhelmed with work. I think you have to be very robust. It took me a long time to realize that I had to look after to some extent myself and my family
Mhm,
more. And I think most doctors are poorly trained. And I think most healthcare professionals are poorly trained in recognizing that. I think it's much better now. Um, but what hobbies do I have? My hobbies have always been sailing, and I spent 25 years racing an offshore boat, doing transatlantic races and
gosh.
fast races. And one of the reasons that was so useful to me was that if you're on a race for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, you can't be contacted about your work. So I think it's not so much on the day-to-day basis when you're doing your work and you're seeing, as as we all have done, so some very horrific things, but I think it's the ability to get away from it completely and in a way rest the mind. I know that's not a very technical way of doing it, but that's how I've always felt it's good.
Yeah.
And then you may have other hobbies. I collect books, I collect art, but I think you need a broad range of things. It's very easy for all of us to get bound up by our work.
Indeed, and completely consumed by it. And then when you're so consumed, you don't even know until
And
someone says, "Are
yeah,
you all right?" And at Anubix, we've highlighted welfare, and we teach welfare to our staff and radiographers, etc., because it's so important. So moving on from that, I wonder if you could describe a situation that stayed with you and why. We all have a few of those, don't we? Which one is yours?
yeah, I was sort of pondering. I thought you might ask something like that. I think for me, as I've got older, and because of I'm approached to review things, I think it is for me anything that's a miscarriage of justice. And there's one particular case that myself and you probably know the pathologist Dick Shepherd, who
Hmm.
we're long-standing friends and foes, and they were great friends. But we had a case probably 20, 25 years ago, and it was of a man called Robert Burnett who had been arrested for sexual assault, for rape, and he'd been in prison for 15 years or so. At one point, what happened was another police force were investigating an allegation of rape against somebody else, and it transpired that the circumstances were very similar. Two separate police forces. The short story is that he had been convicted on bad medical evidence that hadn't been challenged in court and hadn't been recognized by the defense team because he had learning difficulties and learning issues
Mm.
and had constantly um, stated that he was innocent. He had been ignored. We reviewed the case, and it's unusual for medical evidence to completely turn case, but it was absolutely clear that the injuries that the complainant, but for which he'd been convicted, had self-inflicted the injuries. It's very rare that you can say without any doubt, but in this case, they were very clear injuries, and it transpired that this was a malicious complaint, as was the one 15 years later. So he was released from prison, and for me, then it reinforced to me the need for standards, for training, for people understanding the nature of forensic evidence or any form of biological evidence, and that it needs to be robust. Where there is doubt, that needs to be expressed. And the evidence that is retained or collected, say by a forensic medical examiner or a forensic nurse, um, or a forensic scientist, it needs to be documented appropriately so that others can review it and challenge it where necessary. So yeah, so Robert Burnett is a case that really emphasized to me the absolute need for to avoid miscarriages of justice, that you have to be meticulous. And I think, you know, what I'm, I suppose, proud of in my career is that I and others developed the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine, which a faculty of the Royal College of Physicians, which has really set standards not only nationally but internationally, and obviously with others. But it's something that I think is really important and not understood.
Indeed, and that's a very, very powerful description of justice, you know, how to get justice. So thank you for that. It's very, very interesting. Mark, I'm going to hand back over to you.
Yes, thank you. Jason, this is a fascinating conversation, and we could go on all afternoon, which there's a danger in that. So I'm just going to ask you just one final question, if I may. And it's something we ask a lot of people when we talk to them, because everyone outside our little world has all sorts of strange ideas about what we forensic people do. So I just wondered what you thought was the biggest misconception that people have about you or your work.
Personally, it is inevitably, whenever I say that I'm a specialist in forensic and legal medicine, people assume I do post-mortems, and I hope that listeners will understand the commonest question I will get from people who I haven't met before but are told that I'm involved in forensic medicine is, how do you manage to cut up dead bodies every day? And I, apart from the fact that it's not really a very nice way of describing postmortems, but that I don't do that. I deal with the living aspects of forensic medicine, which can include other things like torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, human rights. Funnily enough, forensic and legal medicine is a much broader area than forensic pathology itself. But that's, I think, for me, the biggest misconception. And the other thing is, of course, people are misled by television programs, by films, on the capabilities of any of us working in any forensic sector. And I think that the vast majority of my working life is spent trying to manage the expectations of those whose expectations are far too high because of what they see in the media and in news reports about what we can do. I always emphasize to all my students, we are a piece of a jigsaw, we're not the whole jigsaw. And it's the courts that ultimately, based on the evidence we provide, whether it's post-mortem CT reports, whether it's interpretation of a particular mark or injury, it's the courts that have to make that decision. And sometimes they'll be right and sometimes they'll be wrong.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, Jason. And if I can just sort of sum up for our listeners some of the things that I think that we've covered this afternoon. That really, if I had to summarize, I think it's all about taking a holistic approach. And you talked about how you got into this world of being a forensic physician, and the fact that you have what you described as a portfolio career and lots of different interests that come together. And we've heard the importance of that view, really, in, as a medical examiner, in having so many different strands of evidence and being able to bring that all together and view it as a whole. We talked also about the role of radiology and radiography and the way that that's changing. I think you see it playing a bigger role, perhaps in the future, with some interesting developments in terms of the roles of the medical examiner and the pathologist in interpreting the information that radiology can provide. So it's been a really, really fascinating chance to chat with you. I wish we had a lot more time to go on.
And I'd second that. Jason, thank you so much. You've really brought out some of the most important aspects of all that part of the jigsaw and touched on the very serious stuff about the way that, as you say, television programs, they've always got the X-ray upside down, but what the message is that they're sending out is not accurate. We know that. Mark and I know that. So yeah, we could talk to you for hours. We might have to get you back. But for now, this wraps up another episode of Beyond Death. And whilst this concludes today's conversation, remember, it's not the end, because there's always more beyond death.
And if you enjoy our episodes, please follow and like our channel, because we're always keen to improve from the feedback that we receive from you. Thank you for joining us.